What is it about when people use an animal as a symbol of a community? This is the first of two videos that gives a totem perspective on a very old Nordic symbol, the raven, and particularly the raven flag. When we use contemporary anthropology, this very Nordic symbol, the raven, that can be seen in a way that you totally wouldn't have expected, and which I think is much, much cooler than what we usually think about this symbol. My suggestion is seeing the Nordic raven motif as a totem, a symbol of a kind of community that implies kinship with another species, and thereby a kind of community that ties humans into nature. Because when you read the Nordic raven symbolism from this perspective, then the result is a very different one from the more sort of common militant understanding of the symbol, where it's primarily a symbol of war, which means something along the lines of we're going to kill you and the ravens will eat your rotting corpses. And like, symbols have different meanings and many different voices in them. And that reading, the aggressive one, is not directly wrong. The raven standard might definitely have meant something like that when it was led by the heathen army that was ravaging around England in the 9th century. The totemic reading, however, it goes to deeper layers of the raven symbol. And I think it suggests a more fundamental understanding of the raven symbol, which also, by the way, is just existentially much, much more relevant for us today than, whatever hooligan types are coming up with today or even in the 9th century. And importantly, when we look at this ancient flag in that way, then we can discern these voices in the flag that we can today dialogue with, I think, in very compelling ways. Because what is a totem? A totem does not primarily mean, for instance, a kind of personal animal patron spirit. I suspect that is what most New Agers would probably tend to think when they hear the word totem. But in fact, a totem is more than anything. It's a kind of community. The root of the word totem in the Native American Anishinaabe language, totem, means a clan. And a totem is a community that cuts across different species. For instance, tying humans together with specific animals. A totem is a kind of human community that includes kinship with other beings around us, and therefore it ties us into bonds of responsibility with others in nature. And hang with me a little bit on this, because it's not just hippie talk. There's a piece of analytical scholarship behind this, which I've actually been applying for postdoc funding to set up. I generally believe that scholarship needs to be brought into play and made accessible and performed in a way that it can be brought into dialogue with contemporary culture. And that's what I'm trying to do with this reflection on raven totemism. Particularly in the coming video, where I'm launching the contemporary raven symbol, which is based on this scholarship on the history of rejected totemic relations. The raven symbol is a part of actually a raven myth that you find all around the circumpolar northern hemisphere. You find it among Native Americans, Siberians, Chinese, Inuits, and probably many other peoples. And you find it among several European peoples, not just Scandinavians, but also German, French, English, prominently the English, and possibly other European peoples that I am less familiar with. But here's the thing. When you look at the Nordic raven motif in the Iron Age and in the Viking Age archaeology, right, then you can very convincingly see this Nordic raven motif as part of this circumpolar raven totem that you find around the Northern Hemisphere in all these different cultures. And this can give us a new perspective on the raven standard, the raven banner, the raven flag, whatever you want to call it. That is a Viking war banner standard, which is known from a number of chronicles and sagas that are talking about the Viking Age. And by the way, let me just say that this eco-totemic reading of the raven symbol is not just my idiosyncratic idea, though it might sound a little bit like that. If you like reading scholarships, then I suggest reading an article by a couple of Oxford scholars, Thomas and Patricia Thornton. I'll put a link to the article in the video text here. They have the idea that they're seeing the Anthropocene, our age, the age of humanity, as the raven scene. Because the raven trickster, as it figures, particularly in American First Nations mythologies, raven can be seen as iconizing humanity. Raven as a symbol of humanity, both in its greed and in its lack of foresight, but also in the wisdom and the genius for change and creativity and adaptation, qualities that are very necessary for us in the situation now where we're entering into an age of transformation. We're going to need a new kind of connectedness with the world if we are to survive the Ragnarok of environmental biodiversity collapse, which is caused by the omnicide of our infantile consumerism. Right, and this connectedness is very clearly signaled in the Nordic modality of the Transarctic or Circumpolar raven myth. But of course, this doesn't mean that I'm saying here that Vikings were eco-hippies. Of course not. They totally weren't. They lived in another age. But it means that if you read the raven flag as part of this Transarctic raven myth, then it does talk about a kind of relation, a kind of kinship tie. And when we look at this, what this can tell us today, then it's meaningful to read this ancient flag today as a call to a less anthropocentric kind of community. A community that is based on this connectedness, these kinship ties to the natural world. And this connectedness is a characteristic totemic feature. And in normal human language, it means exactly what it looks like. It means connectedness. So, for instance, if you look at raven clans among American First Nations on the Pacific coast, then you find that they have this typically totemic idea that the humans in the raven clan has an inner nature that's raven. But the raven also has an inner nature that is human, and that's in its capacity of ancestor. As an ancestor of the raven clan, the raven is a human. And this is why you often see these mixings between human and totemic animal, which signals the tie between the human and the totem. So, for instance, they can be sort of folded into each other, and then you get this hybridity. For instance, you get a human face inside the raven. And exactly this motif, the hybrid of the human mixed into the bird, is a very prominent motif in the Nordic Iron Age and in the Viking Age, right? And it's awful difficult to see exactly what kind of bird is an image is showing, because they're very stylized, but there are samples that it looks fairly clear that it must be corvids. And in Old Norse, there isn't necessarily a very strong distinction between different kind of corvids, such as crows or ravens, right? And as any child knows, the god Odin has two ravens called Hugin and Munin, and that means something like mind and memory or something like that. Note that it's human mental capacities, and this is a totemic aspect again. The inner nature of raven seems to be human. And in the archaeology, we see this almost literally illustrated in these ravens or birds linked to human heads or faces. You see the human face tied to the bird. You see it spectacularly in these helmets that we know from the Vendel era in places like England and Sweden. For instance, the Sutton Hoo helmet, whose whole face is composed by this flying bird. And there's also so-called bracteate medallions from the Iron Age, where you often see these birds with a beak turned towards the rider, almost as if it's talking to him, right? And the rider is often wearing this bird-like helmet or headgear or something like that. And perhaps there's even a bird coming out of his hair or something that's a little bit weird. These riders have been identified as, or interpreted as images of Odin, which is a kind of different discussion. There are also all these different kinds of Frankish and Germanic double bird images, and there are loads of examples of bird masking and bird-human mixing in the archaeology of the late Iron Age and the Viking Age, right? Now, particularly these bird fibulae from the late Iron Age, where you see human faces peer out of the body of a corvid-like bird, probably ravens. They have different levels of stylization, but it's exactly this clearly totemic raven in the human mask inside the forms that has formed the basis of the new design of the raven flag. You also see this connection of human and bird in the so-called spear dances that are also from the Iron and the Viking Age archaeology, and you often see these two like birds growing out of the human head like horns. Again, possibly this totemic association between the human mind and the bird somehow. But why have so many people had this widespread, apparently, raven totemism? I think the basic background for this is that ravens have certain human-like characteristics. They're famously intelligent birds. They tend to stay close to human settlements because they're scavengers. They're eating leftovers. You know, and in a sense, they're sort of almost sharing human meals, or also eating a kind of human meals. They can imitate human voices. They also like battlefields. So people saw them as bringing the dead to the other world. In the Nordic world, there may have been an association between ravens and Valkyries. They are monogamous, which might in many contexts, some contexts at least, associate to humanity, even though I'm not sure how monogamous humans really are. And anyway, ravens are in some senses human-like, and therefore they signal humanity as inherently tied to the natural world, right? If you want to express it in normal hippie language. You could also express this in anthropology-heavy Ooga Booga language, when then you could say that raven strongly signifies the animic ontology, where individual subjectivity is an ever-present element of perception. So the human face inside the raven expresses perspectivism, the idea of human subjectivity as inherent to point of view, and blah, 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 blah. In normal language, it just means that raven is connectedness or kinship between humanity and nature. The world is filled with other persons that aren't all humans, but require some sort of respect, as the British scholar Graham Harvey is formulating the basic idea of animism. So it is about animism fundamentally somehow. This symbol here, the mask in the raven, perhaps it represents animism as such, you know, and maybe that's why raven is important for all the peoples who basically know ravens. And it seems that all these different people that know ravens have sort of seen this animist, you know, potential, particularly this animal. And this is why the Nordic raven motif is part of this wider trans-ethnic, you know, circumpolar raven myth that you find among all these different peoples. Typically, people have the idea that the raven is a trickster, an ancestor, creator, and often associated with shamanism. And when we look at the Nordic god Odin, who is also called the raven god, then we see that he is exactly trickster, ancestor, creator, and shaman, right? So through Odin, the raven god, you could say that the Nordic raven motif has a remarkable similarity, for instance, with Siberian and North American raven myths. For instance, North Americans, Native Americans, they have these raven clans. And this culture is a very prominent on the Pacific West Coast. And as mentioned, there is this idea that the members of the Raven clan are ravens inside. And that almost mirrors the way that ravens have something human inside. And it's almost like an animist mystery. When these transformation masks, they open, and they show the human face, and that's typically worn by a Raven clan member, who is of course somehow a raven inside. So there is again this mirroring between the mask, which has a human inside the raven, and the human dancer, which has a raven inside a human, right? So the human and raven is sort of folded into each other like Chinese boxes in this totemic perception of reality. And that is what is revealed or performed when the raven mask opens and shows the human nature of raven. And in these Iron Age fibulae from Scandinavia, we see exactly this totemic motif, the human inner nature of raven. So if you look at the double masks that you also find, you see exactly the same in North European archaeology, that they're sometimes doubled. Raven motif is often represented in pairs, and this is quite natural because in the natural world, you often see ravens in pairs. But bottom line, when the raven god, Nordic raven god Odin, is an ancestor deity for a whole number of European groups, Swedish, Norwegian, Danish, English, and so on. I think there's also some connection to French dynasties. Then the raven flag can be read in this way as a totemic mark of connectedness to Raven, the creator and trickster. We are, in a sense, we can say that we are similar to these American First Nations, the Tlingit, the Haida, the Chimchan, and so on, in the sense that we are kind of Raven clan, or perhaps some of us are Raven clan. We have a totemic mark, like the Haida mask. It signals the connectedness of a community that sees humanity as tied into nature. So when this raven mark was brought into war in the Viking Age, then this is probably not only because ravens eat the slain and Odin is a god of war, so carrying his bird into the battlefield signals to the other warriors that we're sending you all to Odin now. That is likely part of the message, yeah. But the scholarship that I've seen has, I think, overlooked that raven is a totem. And that means that when people are carrying this mark into a war, then they probably also do this because they identify somehow with raven, right? If the raven was their force in a sense, and that's an important part of why they carried this mark, then that doesn't look like coincidence when these are people who see the raven god as their ancestor, and they're carrying the raven standard into battle. It looks like totemism. That's what it looks like. And of course, when people carry a totemic symbol that somehow represents their community into a war, then this symbol is militant in that situation, of course. But that is the same if you lead any symbol of any community into a war. If you take the French flag into a war, then it's militant in that situation. That doesn't mean that it doesn't still symbolize a community of people in a very specific way. The ideology of liberty, fraternity, and equality, which is the motto of the French Republic, and which is symbolized by those three colors, the tricolor, right? Now, and wars are also where history is recorded. So it's war situations where we see the raven flag used, or the raven totem brought in this way. Now, the source material on the raven flag is a little bit thin. It's just so thin that it's a bit mysterious, and there are some who question if this flag has existed at all. But I suspect there are scholars in Norse religion who think their own arse is a literary construction. The raven flag has been described at battles in the Viking Age at Contesbury in 878, at Clontarf in 1014, and at Ashington in 1016. And then there are loads of descriptions of ravens as visions in connection with battles and so on. There's a handful of sagas and chronicles chronicles that report a quite consistent complex of sort of war banner belief and practice, which the Raven banner is a part of. But it's also extend beyond the Raven banner. For instance, the Norwegian King Harald the Hard Ruler, he led a banner to England, and that banner might have been a raven, because it has a similar name. It's called Landeven, which in other sources is associated with a raven, but this is not explicit in that source. But the banner has a similar power to what is described with the Raven banner myths. There's also another story, which is a kind of a myth about how the Danish national flag, the Dannebro, appeared. It fell from the sky during a battle and possessed or signaled this supernatural force that turned the battle in favor of the Danes. And this is a myth about the Danish flag, and it's part of this overall medieval complex about what this kind of powerful war banners do. There are some who see, by the way, the Raven flag as the original Danish flag, which is a quite bold statement for a number of reasons. For instance, these banners were not nationalist in that way, but they're totemic, attached to specific kinship groups. It's a very different thing somehow. And also Raven banners have been led by Vikings that weren't Danes. But still it's worth noting that the Dannebro fell from the sky in a battle at this crusade against the heathen Estonians, and it brought victory to King Valdemar the Conqueror. Now his father was Valdemar the Great, and he had his decisive battle at Grate Heath against Knut, another contester for the throne. And this battle was totally charged with exactly this kind of raven symbolism that we know from the Viking Age battles, like Clontarf and so on. The sources don't mention any raven banner at Grate Heath, but the ravens signal the victory in supernatural ways, comparable to the flag in his son's battle, the Danish flag that is still used. There were ravens showing him where to place his army. They came down and flew so low over his warriors that they could touch them with their spears. And this happened just one generation before the Christian Crusader flag came down similarly and heralded and brought the victory to his son, Valdemar the Conqueror, right? So it's tempting to see this kind of something going on around the Danish flag, which is, by the way, a very old national symbol. Perhaps there's some level where there is a domestication of the totemic raven symbolism going on somewhere around that. The white cross represents a very different worldview in a sense. It represents a promise or a longing towards a transcendent, otherworldly salvation. And this transcendent expectations then comes and replaces the raven trickster, which with its sort of tight entanglement, connection, tie between human and the totemic animal. Perhaps between human and world, perhaps between human and reality, perhaps between human and nature. Right? But of course, this is not like a literal replacement. It's not, somebody wasn't like sewing the white cross on top of the raven banner, of course. The raven totem was associated with the royal dynasty. It was a symbol of community. And part of this same kind of idea about these medieval powerful banners that would then later produce the Christian Danish flag. But when Christianity became consolidated, little by little it became obsolete and at some point rejected, and other symbols of community emerged. But importantly, the kind of community that's signaled by this very ancient symbol, raven totem, is a very different one from the kind of us that we usually think of today. It's not a nationalist kind of symbol, and that's why I think it's relevant for us today. This ancient symbol, and also like different groups have used it in Northern Europe. There were Norwegians or Acadians who used it at Clontarf, and And these were people for whom ethnicity in this national sense wasn't as important as it is for us, I think. They were much more like clans and kinship lines that augmented their power by intermarrying and liaising in different ways. In a sense, they were quite trans-ethnic people. And these kinds of totems, they are not all that ethno-specific. Like, if you look at the raven totem in North America, then you see that it's a pretty trans-ethnic thing. You see raven totemism in very different ethnic groups who are somehow attached to the symbol, perhaps in different ways. You see Inuits and you see different Northwest Coast Pacific First Nations all having this raven mythology. There are raven myths in Hellenic culture, there's raven myths in Celtic culture. In Cornwall, they believe that King Arthur lived on in the form of a raven. It's a remarkably totemic motive. There's even a also remarkable raven mythology in the Bible. And this is surprisingly consistent with some of the meanings that I'm talking about here. It's a little bit weird. In the narrative of Noah's Ark, Noah sends out the raven, and as it flies back and forth, the dry land emerges. This totally resembles the Native American myth of the raven as a creator. This is so conspicuously Haida, that and some have actually speculated that perhaps the Native Americans got part of their raven mythologies from the Bible, which I don't really believe at all. In Western culture, there's often been this tendency that people want to impose it on everybody else and cast Western culture as the origin of everything. And I mean, come on, American raven mythology is very much its own thing and so rich in its own. But it's, when you look at the biblical raven myth, it's still tempting to just say, "Wow, is there a raven myth in the Bible?" And even one that, when we dialogue with it today, we could see perhaps it has a relation to raven leading the way out of environmental cataclysm, the Great Flood. That wasn't possible contemporary dialoguing with this myth. Perhaps this raven myth was there. At some point it was pressed in the background, or, it's difficult to say. The Bible is really a kind of a patchwork of different mythologies that are speaking to each other and sometimes against each other, actually. Well, the main role of Christianity, however, in Northern Europe has primarily been to function as rejection of raven mythologies. Sometimes the raven mythology persists. In a variant area in Sweden, people just keep calling ravens Odin's fåglar, and they keep taboos around them and stuff like that. In Norway, people would take omens of ravens when they would come and eat specific meals that had been prepared from them when you had slaughtered an animal, like a very clear sacrificial culture connected to slaughtering. In Denmark, the totemic idea stays live, but in very demonized forms. There are a lot of these transformation myths of ravens that are really humans inside and so on. But when you go through history, this becomes a curse. The Valravn, the death raven, is a cursed being. It's almost as if people are trying to sort of exorcise this connectedness with the world, which is expressed by this ancient totemic idea that raven has something human inside. Sometimes you also see raven in a more positive and more trickster-like role. There's an amazing Danish ballad which is called Raven Leads Runes, and it talks about how a woman who's longing for her knight, she sends a raven with runes to turn the wind on his ship and bring him back to her. Right, and it's one way of reading this, perhaps a metaphoric or symbolic way of reading it could be to see the woman as an image of humanity who is calling that which is across the water, which would be the other world, the god, perhaps her knight, and she calls him with runes, and the raven is a trickster that transports the invocation to the other world to call the spirit or god. And that is a very trickster-like role, comparable to what you see in trickster figures in different cultures. But the dominating image is that ravens are the messengers of the devil. They bring the dead souls to hell, and they live in gallows hills, and they're super scary, and they're omens of bad luck, and they're called, dig this, the apostle of Satan. And this goes actually all the way back to the encounter with Christianity, where there's a number of visionary narratives that narrate how the heathen raven is magically transformed into a Christian dove, and that is an image of the conversion of heathens. And this transformation into a dove is definitely a kind of symbolic domestication. So the raven totem is subjected to this domestication and demonization, and perhaps we can compare this to something we actually see happening in Chinese raven mythology. Because in China, in the Bronze Age, the Zhou dynasty replaced the Shang culture, which had one of these typical raven totemisms. And when the Zhou dynasty took over, they then narrated the raven tales of the Shang culture in ways that domesticated the ravens. And they proceeded to explode population and intensify farming and . And according to these scholars that I mentioned in the beginning, Thornton and Thornton, the Zhou dynasty controls and cancels the trickster aspect of raven. And thereby they contribute, according to Thornton and Thornton, they contribute to a general movement in Chinese history away from Taoism, which is this super sympathetic, organic, dynamic thinking about transformation as the harmonious way of the world, towards Confucianism, which is this totally patriarchalist, conservative theory of social compliance. And according to Thornton and Thornton, they even see the culmination in this movement in Mao Zedong, who was a socialist and thereby an ultra-modernist, who literally declared war on nature. I mean, you can't make this up. This, stuff up like, we, the great Chinese people, are war with nature itself. La, 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 la. But the point is that we could see also our own history in relation to the raven motif as a history of rejection, demonization, domestication of this raven totem. A totem that connects us to the world, but which is being demonized intensively, right? In Denmark, it's being replaced with this white cross on the Crusader flag, right? But if you read the earlier raven symbol from a contemporary research perspective, then it makes sense to see the raven totem as signifying a community of the descendants of raven, a community based on this trickster totem of kinship, totemic kinship ties, basically. And that's what I will be talking about in the next video, where we're taking back the contemporary raven flag, symbol of a kind of kinship that will, a kind of kinship with nature that will empower us to face the eco-Ragnarok of the contemporary world. Thanks for listening.